Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of culture and context on psychiatric diagnosis and how important it is for DSM-5 on all DSMs to consider these two aspects of psychiatric disorders. As you know, DSM has given an emphasis and has always, but even more this time, to the importance of culture and context on how psychiatric disorders express themselves in different cultures and different contexts. I have done, over the trajectory of my life, a lot of research with Latino children particularly, trying to investigate how culture and context affects both the diagnoses and the expression of psychiatric disorders. What we have found in studies in which we have compared Puerto Rican island children with Puerto Rican children in the United States, particularly in the Bronx, is that the context in which a child lives, even if they are from the same ethnic group, is very important in the way, in the risk of psychiatric disorders. For example, we have found that children in the Bronx, Puerto Rican children in the Bronx, have a higher risk of developing psychiatric disorders over time. Particularly psychiatric disorders that are disruptive, meaning attention deficit disorder, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorders. These are disorders that are called disruptive behavior disorders. And we found that when we try to explain why Puerto Rican children in the Bronx had higher risk, had higher prevalence rates of these disorders than children in Puerto Rico, we found that a lot of it had to do with the fact that there were many more risk factors in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico. The interesting thing is that this is the same ethnic group coming from the same culture, yet the way that the disorders occur is different. They have higher prevalence of these disorders. And this is, we found, that due to the fact that there are much higher risk of adverse events and much higher risks of family disruption in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico. When I talk about adverse events, I mean things like exposure to violence. I mean things like discrimination due to ethnicity. I mean things like school problems, drugs, access to drugs. All these things that occur very often in low-income ghetto children and in the areas where most of the Puerto Rican children live. And when children are exposed to these adverse events, and when the family that is accustomed to coming from the island and lives in extended family systems and community systems where there's a lot of support, when all that is gone and when they come to the States and their family system is disrupted, and the community that used to give them support is disrupted. What happens is that many times parents do not give as much warmth and support to their children because they themselves are stressed. And so what we have found throughout this study, and we followed these children over time, over a 3-year period, is that as they grow older, and they're exposed to all these adversities in the community and in the schools, and particularly to discrimination and being a minority in the States, as opposed to Puerto Ricans, the probability that they will develop a psychiatric disruptive disorder is significantly higher than children in Puerto Rico. So that with time, children in Puerto Rico, both girls and boys, these disorders tend to decline. And that's what you see in the other non-Latino population. But in the Bronx, the Puerto Rican children, they start with high rates and they continue, and then the high rates go up and they continue with very high rates of disorder. So that tells us that there is something else, besides the area that psychiatric disorders are all biological. We know that that disorders have a biological component and that some children are at more risk than others. But, definitely the environment, the context in which they are, and the culture in which they're being raised. And the mores of that culture could be either protective or risky. And when they come to the States and live under these adverse circumstances in the ghettos, the adversity affects the family, affects the children who are vulnerable, and their risk is higher. So the lesson to learn is that when a psychiatrist is making a diagnosis to a child, it is important not only that they look at the history or the psychiatric history to see whether there is a genetic vulnerability, but that they also examine the context in which that child lives and the culture that he comes from, because that will tell him or her what are the risks that this child has in terms of particularly disruptive behavior disorders like the ones I told you about. Okay?